The last time we were inundated with messages and questions from our listeners, we want to put it out there again that the Muslim Family Law Hub educates and advocates for equitable family law outcomes in South Africa, but it's an educational platform for now, providing resources to help Muslims, especially women, navigate both Islamic and South African family law. So do go and go to the website. Fatima will direct you now again to the website, because today we are focusing specifically on Islamic divorce, also known as talaq, and we know that it's governed, Fatima, by Sharia law. It involves very specific religious principles and practices, but we always speak about this intersection between South African law and then of course Muslim law, and then given the fact that South Africa does recognize religious marriages, so there's often a bit of confusion in as far as how it fits into the broader framework of the Constitution. But to just start off the conversation then for us, speak to us a little bit about Islamic divorce per se and what is allowed therein.
Okay, shukran Khadija. There are various types of Islamic divorce, right? And in terms of the classical Islamic fiqh. But today I'm going to predominantly focus on two types. Well, actually three, because if you go onto the Muslim Family Law Hub's website and you go under the divorce tab and then you look at the Islamic divorce tab, you'll see there we pose a question. I want to end my Muslim marriage. What Islamic divorce options are available to me? And we then say the answer is your Islamic divorce options are the following. The talaq, which is initiated usually by the husband.
Yes.
There's the khula, which is not very commonly used, and that is initiated by the wife. It's not commonly used in South Africa, but it's used in other places in the Muslim world. And then you have the fasq, which is basically an annulment through an Islamic court or a qadi. And this fasq is usually at the behest of the wife. And in South Africa, and specifically in Cape Town, the talaq and the fasq are the most commonly used form of divorce. We would like to advocate for a greater usage of khula, and I'll explain that as we go along. But those are the two main forms of divorce that our community utilizes when they try and exit a Muslim marriage in South Africa.
Now, within that context, and of course, we spoke about the fact that at the intersection of South African law and Islamic law. And I'm sure, Camilla, that this happens at times because people do tend to think that since religious marriages are recognized, there are certain laws that automatically apply to them. What would sort of then be the starting point for somebody? I remember the last time we spoke about these different types of marriages and contracts that can be entered into. Now, when it comes to dissolving those.
Very often when a client first comes to see an attorney, the marriage is broken down. So she wants to know very often the female, wants to know what are her options in terms of Islamic divorce, how she initiates that. And Fatima will talk a little bit about all the different organizations that she can approach to try and get this to exit an Islamic marriage. And then at the same time, we will talk about exiting her civil marriage. So we try and start both at the same time. And then Fatima, I think maybe you can just tap into what organizations someone can approach to exit an Islamic marriage, and then I will focus on what the approach is in terms of the civil marriage.
That's right, because also we have to distinguish between two types, right? So there are some people who are married by Islamic law only, right? And they will then, historically, if let's say the husband wants to exit the marriage, he will issue the talaq. He will make the talaq pronouncement, where he essentially says to the wife, I talaq you, or some form of saying that he wants to end the marriage. Or you have the scenario where the woman wants out of the marriage and she asks the husband, can you please provide me with a talaq? And he refuses. This happens very often. And she then has to approach an ulama body to obtain a fasakh. So in those particular examples, that is where she's married by Islamic law only. She would then access the Islamic divorce through a ulama body. And in Cape Town, for instance, there are 3 accepted ulama bodies. There's the Muslim Judicial Council in Athlone. There's the Muslim Assembly in Newfields, and the Shura al-Islam, that's on the border of Newfields and Hanover Park. Those are the 3 official bodies. However, there are other bodies as well, also in Athlone, in Mitchell's Plain, that have taken upon themselves to also grant women a fasakh. So those are not necessarily recognized by the official, and that's another discussion, but that is how the woman would then approach these ulama bodies, and she would then apply for a fasakh based on whatever grounds she wishes to exit the marriage. And then of course you have Khadija, those women, they are people who are married by Islamic law and they're married by civil law as well. Right?
Yes, I was just going to.
That's
I
right.
was just going to say that
they're so different.
There are more nuances.
That's right.
Because what we have is the people that are married only by Islamic rights, and the people that are married after 14 December 2014, and they are now automatically married civilly and by Islamic rights. So anyone before the cutoff date, in terms of the Divorce Amendment Act and that Constitutional Court case we were talking about the last time, they will only be governed by Islamic rights.
Yes.
But then also before 2014, like my parents, and there were other people, let's say they wanted to go on Hajj, or they were leaving the country, or they needed to buy a council house, and then it was important for them to have a civil marriage. So some people have married by civil law over the years, and they don't necessarily know that they what it entails, but it essentially means that they're married in community of property, as we discussed the last time. If they go to court or they have a civil marriage concluded, then they're married in community of property if there was no antenuptial contract. And those people, if the couple wants to divorce, they would go through the Islamic divorce. Let's say it's the woman, she wants to get out, she would have to apply for a fasakh, and she has to go to the civil courts to dissolve a civil in community of property marriage. So those are 2 processes that should have to, or him or her would have to kind of initiate if they were married by civil law, which many people were married. Majority of people were married by Islamic law only, but there are people, like I know my parents were married for some reason by civil law as well,
My
in
parents
community.
as well, yes.
That's right. So
that often happened when people went on Hajj. It was
That's right.
It was a requirement. So many people were told, if you want to, you've got to go do this.
That's right. And then they would be married. And the interesting thing what happened in the past is that, let's say she was married by a civil law as well, and now she goes through the South African courts to get a civil divorce. Then her husband is still refusing to grant her the talaq. That is usually referred to as a limping marriage. So she's now free in terms of the civil law, but her husband is not giving her the talaq, and she's struggling to obtain a fasakh. That was also very common, a woman who had what you call a limping marriage.
Wow.
That's right, because they managed to get this civil divorce, but they're still not able to exit their Islamic marriage.
Is this because there's much clearer administrative and legal processes in place when it comes to civil law?
Oh,
Definitely.
I'm so glad you
asked that. Fatima's going to
seem very, very blurry when it comes
Fatima is going to touch on a very important topic, and that is that in terms of civil marriage, there's an act. There are rules, there are regulations, and there's certain tick boxes that you need to comply with. But in terms of approaching the ulama bodies, in terms of approaching the ulama bodies, that is not necessarily the case. And Fatima will talk on that in more detail.
That's right. I'm sorry about that call, Adija. In any event, Kamila is completely correct. So as I explained, those people who, for instance, are married by civil law and they want to get a civil divorce, right? And whether it's Muslim or non-Muslim, they would then go through what you call the Divorce Act. And in the Divorce Act, there are clear grounds on which grounds you can obtain a divorce.
So you can obtain a divorce in terms of irretrievable breakdown of the marriage, mental illness, or continuous unconsciousness. But there's also a list of procedures that you need to follow, and there are timelines in terms of meeting those procedures. So there is a process to follow, and there is, although the process can be abused, there is a process to follow nonetheless.
It's much clearer.
And it's much clearer, and there's a start date and there's an end date. And worst case scenario, the end date is a trial. Best case scenario, the parties are able to resolve it and come to some sort of an agreement, which is made, and the divorce is granted on that basis. But Fatima will touch on the
Islamic law
Islamic law procedures, and it doesn't have the same kind of rules and regulations that we have in terms of the Divorce Act, the uniform rules of court.
In terms of South African law.
Exactly.
Yeah. So also to just explain, in South African law, you have a no-fault divorce system. So the husband or the wife, they can come to court and they just have to allege, let's say they don't, there's no issues around mental health or unconsciousness, and they want to end the marriage. They'll say, our marriage is broken down irretrievably, we don't love each other, we haven't been living together for the past 6 months, and we want the court to dissolve our marriage. In Islamic law, it's obviously a bit more complicated. So we know that, for instance, in Islamic law, the husband has the unilateral right of talaq, unless, of course, the wife has secured herself the talaq tafweed. Remember, in our last episode, we indicated that if women draw up their Muslim marriage contracts, they should ask for that delegated right of talaq, which is the talaq tafweed. In most cases, women have not done that. And that means the husband then has the unilateral right to pronounce the talaq. He doesn't need a reason. In the Sunni schools of thought, he doesn't need witnesses. He can simply tell her, I talaq you, as long as he makes his intention clear. So there is no kind of due process that has to be followed with respect to the talaq per se. In other Islamic countries, a husband has to, some countries like in Egypt, the husband has to come to court. He can't just say, I talaq you. He has to appear before the qadi. But here in South Africa, because Islamic law is not applied, the husband will say, I talaq you, and that means it's be effective. The parties will then go to the ulama bodies, and they will obtain, once the iddah is over of the wife, they will then obtain a talaq certificate. And this is usually for state purpose. Other institutions will want proof that the marriage, Muslim marriage has ended. They would go to a ulama body for the talaq certificate. So that's the talaq. And even within the talaq, there are various rules on what is the best form of granting a talaq. For the fasakh, so let's say the husband refuses to grant the talaq, which very often happens. Now the woman wants out. Let's say she's being abused, or let's say he's not providing nafaka, she's working and she's seeing to the children, and he's just not contributing in any way. And so she wants out. She then goes to ulama body, and she has to apply, and she has to fill out, they give her a form, and she has to sit. They usually require the woman to go through 2 or 3 counseling sessions with the husband. The couple has to come in before they set your matter down for the hearing before the qadi. The issue is that there is no, as in the South African law, you have your clear grounds set out in a divorce act. There's also, as Kamla correctly says, in the High Court rules, Superior Court rules, is a set procedure. It will tell you, on this day you issue a summons,
10
days later he must say this.
10 days later he does that.
That's right. That procedure is not necessary. The grounds, first of all, for fasakh, as well as the procedure, is not necessarily clearly set out when you're going to an ulama body. And I think that's very important, is that ulama bodies need to have, for the public, when the public accesses the website, they can clearly see, oh, these are the grounds which I can get a fasakh. If the husband doesn't nafaka me, if he's physically abusing me, if he's emotionally abusing me, if whatever reason, if he's decided to leave Islam, those clear grounds must be set out. should ideally be set out so that the woman knows these are the grounds I can. And it's mostly women.
Yes, of
if you
course.
go to these ulama bodies, because the man has the right of talaq. It's women who will benefit from clear guidelines as to what are the criteria that the Qadi will apply when considering whether to give you a fasakh or not.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. And to be quite honest, the Hub has approached all these bodies to ask, what are your criteria and can you put it up so that women can know, when I apply, these are the criteria. And that's the one issue, is the criteria. The second issue is, what is the process?
Yeah.
Right? Like Kamala indicated, you have rules in South African, and it's very extensive rules. And we're not saying that we need the same level of detail in the ulama body's rules on the procedure, but at least provide like a 6-step or 10-step
Yes,
process. Something on your website. If you want a fasakh, when you come in, you will first have to fill out an intake form. You will also have to indicate A, B, and C, your grounds, who the parties are, the addresses, etc., which they do. But then the next step will be, you will be required to undergo counselling with one of our counsellors on site. What happens if the husband refuses, which very often happens, which is why sometimes a fasakh takes really long to secure, because the husband, they have to go through counselling, but the husband refuses to come to counselling, or he refuses to come to the fasakh hearing. Or he doesn't come to the counselling and then he appears on the date of the fasakh and says, no, but I don't want this, and I am refuting whatever she's saying. Right? So there needs to be clear guidelines as to, in various scenarios, what will happen.
If I can just say one thing quickly, Fatima, Khadija, what further complicates matters is that now, along with now we have a dual process. So the wife is going to the Islamic divorce route to try and exit her Islamic marriage, and she's also going the civil route to exit her civil marriage. And what complicates matters is that the husband uses the fact that they are not divorced Islamically as a stick to beat the white with in the civil marriage. And so he can be obstructive in terms of the Islamic approach by not participating in the counselling, refusing to participate, refusing to attend the hearing, etc., etc., etc. And without those clear guidelines, he can use that to delay the entire process and also to delay the civil process.
We just want to remind you to go onto our YouTube page. There you will find one video specifically framed around, and it was specific to using the website, the Muslim Family Law website, and navigating your way around it. Also then, just to catch up with our previous segment that we had with our guests with regards to marriage and the types of contracts that can be entered into. Of course, Fatima, you were telling us now, and it makes absolute sense. We don't even want to start with the fact that these Muslim organizations that you mentioned are mostly, for the most part, we know it's men, it's male voices. And so more often than not, yes, it's women that go to these places. We also realize, and I want to just add that in the, Kamila, you were saying beforehand about how when it comes to civil law and a divorce, there's specific tick boxes. So Fatima was speaking now about the fact that when it comes to Muslim law and when it comes to these organizations, there's no specific criteria, there's no specific process also in place. And
Correct.
Worse than that, we always, again, when we speak about the Constitution, we speak about protecting cultural and religious rights. Paradoxically so, and ironically and sadly, within our Muslim context, often women's spirituality is questioned when they don't show sufficient, let's call it, patience or whatever it may be, or they are questioned in terms of the whys and hows of why the divorce is taking place. And as you said earlier on, Fatima, because the male voice takes precedence often.
She says, they tell her she must have sabr and go work on her marriage.
Exactly.
So just to also, a lot of these ulama bodies, they are not, so in their defense, right, they are not funded by the state. they are funded through whatever means they have raised their funds. And so, like we explained within South African courts and the rules, those are all state-funded institutions and legislation. So I can understand that we don't necessarily have the funding, for instance, to send a sheriff to the husband in a fasakh application to say you have to appear in court or you have to come to these proceedings, because maybe there isn't sufficient funding. But I definitely think that to at least set out procedures, to criteria, that is not a complicated process. And as we know, there are various grounds. In the Hanafi is the most restrictive grounds for obtaining a fasakh, whereas the Maliki school allows various grounds, including emotional abuse, for a woman obtaining a fasakh. And all we're saying is that needs to be clarified, because the law needs to be clear, it needs to be certain, so that people know how to navigate it. Secondly, what is the procedures? Upfront tell people these are the procedures. As a woman, these are the procedures you have to comply with before you get into the court. Thirdly, what is the rules of evidence that apply? As I know that women are not necessarily allowed representation, and if they are allowed a representation, then they're not necessarily allowed to speak. So in a normal South African court, you can go and represent yourself in a divorce hearing, or you can instruct a lawyer or then an attorney who then briefs an advocate, right? Historically, women had to appear on their own. I know it's changed in some of the bodies now where they can bring somebody with to represent them. But historically, it was quite daunting, because she'd then come before the court and the husband would be there or not be there, and she'd have to set out the case. Sometimes very intimate reasons for wanting to dissolve the marriage, right? And it's not necessarily comfortable to speak before a panel of male, all-male panel. In some of the bodies, there are women represented. I know in Shura al-Islam, they have a very diverse representative group who sits on their fasakh panel. I think at Muslim Assembly as well, the social worker, who's a woman, she sits with the qadi when the hearing is heard, which at least makes the woman feel a bit more comfortable. This is something I've raised in a publication as well, is that we need more female representation in these Sharia courts. Because there are women who qualify to sit and hear divorce hearings. And you might ask, but what's the point? I mean, you applying the Sharia is no, it's neutral, but actually it does impact on the woman and how comfortable and how empowered she feels when she comes before that particular panel, if she sees that there are other women present and she feels comfortable to relate a story. And so that was it's the criteria, it's the process, and then what happens in the court. Like, what are the rules of evidence? In a South African court, you have very clear rules of evidence. So, for instance, hearsay is not allowed. He said, she said, whatever. And are you allowed to bring documentation as proof that he has physically abused you from the medical records from the hospital? Are you allowed to bring as proof the interdict that you took out against him in domestic violence?
If I can just say one thing. One of the most difficult things in a civil divorce is that, and now the woman has representation, right? In a civil divorce, you can, both parties often lawyer up, and they both get an attorney, or one party gets an attorney and the other one doesn't. And if there's been a lot of abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, it is very difficult for that woman to be able to resolve things directly with the husband because of the abuse and the ongoing abuse that's going on. And so she's so traumatized by what's been happening in the marriage that it's very difficult for her. So one of the things that happens in a civil process is she says, you are my attorney, you speak on my behalf, and you be my voice. And can you imagine a woman in a fasakh, in a hearing, where she has been beaten, she has been psychologically abused, and now she needs to represent herself and tell her story in that traumatic state. It's not an easy process for anyone.
Absolutely.
To
Because essentially your dignity is also compromised.
Very much so.
And you're quite possibly in a position where financially you are already feeling incredibly vulnerable, because we know this is what often happens with women.
That's
Yes.
right. And also, so for me, it was, I mean, I've observed some hearings. It's important to understand, for instance, if you come to court as a woman and you say that he did A, B, and C, and this is why I want a fasakh, and he's sitting in that hearing and he denies it all, right? Under Islamic law, he gives an oath and says, I sumba on the Quran that I didn't beat her and I didn't. What will the Qadi's position be on that? Right, because those are what you call rules of evidence, right? Does he then accept the husband's version and doesn't grant because this has happened where women have come to court and say that he's abusive and I want out, and he simply says, but it's not true. I never lifted a finger, right? And let's say she has all the proof to
medical
the medical
records.
records, but he takes an oath, an Islamic oath to say, does the Qadi then have a witness where the Qadi would accept his version because he's saying it on oath, right? And so it's important to understand what are the rules of evidence when you appear before the Qadi applying for your fasakh. So those are, for me, I think it's really important that, and as the hub and public generally should be advocating, law needs to be clear, it needs to be certain. You need to know what are the criteria, what are the procedures, and what are the rules of evidence that will apply, and can I come with somebody to help represent me because I feel very vulnerable being in the same room as this particular person.
Which is why I made mention earlier on about, when we speak about the Constitution also, and we speak about the protection of the right of every individual within South Africa. And yes, one would assume that a person of faith, that from religious bodies, that would be even more emphatically done. And so I'm also very interested to know in what you said earlier on, Kamila, when you spoke about the fact that sometimes this can take place simultaneously. So if one is clear, ideally, if one is clear around all of that, what Fatima explained now, so this is the type of divorce, and simultaneously one comes to speak to a lawyer, and then both of these processes. So how is it such that the one can delay, or that somebody can delay the civil case because of
unfortunately in practice, when a woman wants out, the other party, your husband, can often make it very difficult to do so, and he can use a number of ways to and create huge stumbling blocks for you. So for example, you'll say, can you delegate the talaq to me? And he'll say no. And she'll then try and access the fasakh process, and he'll refuse to cooperate. He'll then cut off all nafaka. He'll stop paying for the children. He'll cut off his medical aid. He'll take the car back that he's gifted her. He'll, so he cuts off, he may have given her a secondary card on his bank account to be able to do groceries and buy things for the children. He'll cut off access of that card, So there's a lot of things that he can do to create huge hurdles for her.
And legally speaking,
if she comes to court for a civil divorce, the court wants to see that she's gotten a religious divorce.
So that's what I was talking about.
Yeah. That was going to be my question.
I was leading up to that. So there's so many things he can do as stumbling blocks. But now, because of the Divorce Amendment Act, a lot of those stumbling blocks we can now deal with in terms of, so if you're married, if the cutoff date being 14 December 2014, we can now, in terms of the civil process, help you with all those things. But one of the stumbling blocks that we still find difficult is the fasakh process. Because of, so the husband can say, but we haven't exited the Islamic marriage.
So you can't get your civil divorce. Because there's a provision which says that you have to get your religious, whether it's Jewish marriage, your Jewish get, your Islamic fasakh or talaq, before the court will grant you your civil divorce.
So that's why we started simultaneously when you want out, you start both processes.
And the attorney will ask in their pleadings that the court directs the husband to give a talaq.
Yes.
So that's one of the things that you will instruct your attorney to do, is he's refusing to grant me the talaq.
Then
The
at least
fasakh is
you
taking long.
You can find a process in which to get that kind of relief and get his cooperation.
Yeah, yeah.
So also just to explain, and so historically, women would go to the ulama body for a fasakh, but the ulama body has no enforcement power. So let's say the qadi then says, we grant you the fasakh on the grounds that he doesn't nafaka you. So now you are free. You've been granted, you get your fasakh certificate, and the qadi and the husband's present, and the qadi tells the husband, for the iddah period, you need to nafaka her. You are still responsible for nafakaing the minor children, the children born of the marriage, and you should therefore ensure that they have a roof over their head, food on the table, school fees, etc. The qadi, with the best of intentions, cannot enforce that. The ulama bodies and qadis have no enforcement powers to ensure that the husband complies with their order.
Which is why
now
they need to get their civil divorce, because the civil divorce is an order of court.
So
and
that
you
is,
can, with enforcement powers, so you can
right.
enforce all those things through a warrant of execution, with the sheriff going there and forcing compliance.
But still, it's a very time-consuming process, it seems to me, for many people, I'm sure.
Yes. So, I mean, I think we might have to have a special show on this particular act that was passed last year, the Divorce Amendment Act, which now allows a woman who was married only by Muslim rights, she's now got a fasakh or a talaq, and she can then now approach the courts, like Kamala says, to get greater rights for herself.
So this came into effect on the 14th of May 2024, and it has retrospective effect up until the 14th of December 2014.
And I think we need a special show.
Yes, we probably do. We probably do, because Ibrahim has just indicated to me that we have about a minute or so left.
Okay.
So I'm gonna ask for your closing comments, each of you. And I know there's still so much to say, but I think we've laid the foundation for this conversation. So Fatima, let's start with you.
That's right. So I didn't even get to discussing khula, which I think we should discuss in our next program, Khadija, because I think it's a very important mechanism to exit a marriage, which is not being utilized sufficiently in South Africa, and I think it should be. And so I would really think it's important to talk about that.
I agree.
But for me, one of the most important messages, I think, is that we need clarity on criteria, processes, rules of evidence when a woman approaches a Sharia counsel to obtain a fasakh. If there's any message I can give over that.
My final thoughts, Khadija, is that when you are faced with a situation where you need to exit your Islamic and your civil marriage, I ask women to please go and get some advice on what to do. There are so many resources out there, like the Muslim Family Hub. You don't need to, you're not in a position anymore where you say, I don't know what to do. Go and find the resources and go and seek the legal assistance to help you through this difficult process. There has been so much work done by women over the years to try and get this Divorce Amendment Act, to try and get Muslim marriages recognized. Use these tools now to protect you and your children.
Absolutely. I agree. And there's legal aid is available, but more than anything else, as both of our experts have advised, educate yourself, inform yourself. Don't do the anecdotal evidence. And don't try to play it by ear. There are laws in place that's meant to protect you and your rights.
Do your research.
Do your research. Kamila Paulse, Director at Herald Gee Attorneys. Shukran so much. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam. Shukran for having us.